to the Kink Perspective. My name's Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. We are going to, I'm going to do a little bit of a different show. These shows that I've been doing these past couple of weeks, I really have not been thinking about it in the context that I have been. And it's ironic, that's what I'm going to be talking about today. But they're all kind of going to be building on each other. And over the coming weeks, all of these episodes that are going to start flowing, they're going to flow together. Because I think we have to start assuming things inside of our community for the bigger picture. Virtue signaling and telling people and kink shaming, all of these things. They all kind of come together. But today, I want to talk about context because somewhere along the way, asking what actually happened becomes suspicious, right? We read stuff online, we hear a story from a friend or someone in the community, we catch one comment, and then start filling in the rest. And then they respond to the version they've built in their head as though that's, the whole person. This is where things start to go sideways. The person in front of them stops mattering. What matters is what they think that person represents. Now, once that happens, and I started talking about this a little bit last week, but right now that was kind of weaponizing using our feelings. Right now, what we're going to start getting into is how the questions start to feel like resistance, and any clarity we ask for is, defensive. And facts become a problem if they don't support the conclusion that's already been made. Now, before I get into all of this today, like I always do, I want to take a moment and say thank you to all of you who tune in every week, day in or week in, week out. Over 4.5 years that I've been doing the show, over almost 7,000 of you. And I'm really excited how big the show has gotten for this community and putting it all together. So I want to thank all of you who tune in, get something out of the show as we move forward. And if you're just finding the show, you've listened to a couple of episodes, somebody recommended it to you. I know recently there were some nice women that were apparently introduced to my show in New Zealand. If you're listening, welcome. I hope you do enjoy the show. My friend let me know. She shared a couple of the shows with you, so hope you enjoy it. But I want you all to know, as I always do, every comment, every message I get, every DM somewhere, I read them all. And I do respond to you. Thousands of comments a month because I want you all to know you're being heard, right? So if you do me a favor, if you're listening on Spotify and you're on the app, go to the 3 little dots, click those, click rate the show, hit it 5 stars. That really makes me happy because it allows others to keep finding the show to keep growing, for me to keep it free like I've done all of these years. If you're on YouTube, like, subscribe. You'll find out when a new show drops. I'm still working that one out a little bit, so you got to be patient with me. Same on Apple, right? If you're on Apple Podcast, rate the show. I want it to grow everywhere so more and more people in our community, in those places in the world where they're even trying to make a community, can find some answers. And if you want to support the show directly, there is a link in the show's description. Any amount works, helps the show and these conversations keep moving forward. Right? All right. Let's get back to this. So none of this means responsibility here disappears. If someone behaves badly or crosses a line, pressures another person, causes harm, sends unwanted messages, that stuff still belongs to that person. But what I want to talk about today is that context matters. What happened before, what was said, what was missing, what that relationship was, and what each person understood at the time. All of this matters. And lately, these conversations, you can't even get into them. And I'm going to bring some context from my own. Part of the show is context from my own. Now, removing those things doesn't make the conversation cleaner. It makes it easier to force a simple answer into something that may not be simple at all. So today, I really want to look at what happens when people stop responding to who you are and start arguing with what they've already decided you represent. Once that shift happens, the conversation is usually over because there's no going back. And that becomes, there is no more discourse. Then we are seriously drawing a line between us versus them. And that's it. That's what it represents. So first I want to talk about when interpretation replaces information. The first problem is how quickly a small amount of information becomes a complete story. Now, we see a comment, an image, an exchange, or even a single word, and the missing pieces get filled in almost immediately. Now, sometimes that comes from their own experience. Other times it comes from whatever the community is focused on lately. Now, either way, what they assume happens starts carrying the same weight as what they actually know. We all interpret things, that's normal. None of us enter a conversation without history and opinions and expectations. The problem, though, begins when we stop recognizing the difference between what we saw and what we added to it. Now, online, between Fetish.com, Fetlife, and all the other places, if someone posts a sexually explicit image, even like Reddit, I think you can. I'm not really a big Reddit person. People begin assigning motives to them, right? Now, someone responds sharply in the comment section, and suddenly their entire character is being discussed. A small piece of behavior becomes enough for people to decide what kind of person they're dealing with, even though most of the surrounding information is still missing. Online spaces make it easier because we rarely have the whole exchange. We're not hearing tone. We don't know what happened privately. We don't even understand the relationship between the people involved, what was even discussed, or whether a comment was part of a much bigger conversation. We're looking at fragments, but fragments can feel complete when they confirm something we already believe. And that is where interpretation starts replacing information. Once the conclusion feels emotionally true, clarification becomes difficult. Now, a person might say, hey, that's not what I meant, but people hear defensiveness. They may explain what happened beforehand, but then guess what? We call that an excuse. They may point out something that's been misunderstood, and the correction is treated as proof they're unwilling to take responsibility. And we see this play out over and over and over again on social media in all forms. The conversation has become impossible because the answer was decided before the question was asked. And you can see this in the questions people choose. They're not asking because they want information. They're asking in a way that focuses the other person to defend themselves against the conclusion someone's already built. Why are you minimizing what happened? Why are you protecting this person? Why can't you just admit what you did? Those aren't always questions. They're statements, and sometimes they're accusations. This does not mean every request for clarification is honest. People absolutely use context to muddy the water or avoid responsibility or exhaust someone until they've stopped pushing back. We should be able to recognize that without deciding that every attempt to add information here is manipulation. Context can change what something means without making the behavior acceptable. Intent can matter without canceling the impact. A person can have caused harm and still be misrepresented in the story being told about them. Those things can exist at the same time, even if the internet prefers a clean answer. The real problem is not the interpretation itself, it's that forgetting interpretation is still interpretation. When we start treating our first reading of a situation as fact, we stop gathering information and begin defending a story. At that point, we're no longer trying to understand what happened. We're trying to make everything that follows fit the conclusion we've already chosen. And I think at some point, we're all guilty of this. We've all probably have done it. I can tell you right now that I've done this in my life. When I look back at the man I was, or the boy growing up into the teenager into the young adult, I'm sure I made these mistakes along the way. And we try to limit them as we move forward in life. But I bet you I could probably look back and I can come to some, thoughts or conclusions. I think even recently there was a case I was following on something and I came to the wrong conclusions because I didn't ask enough questions. Right? We only get a version. But here comes this next part I want to talk about, turning a person into a category. Now, once interpretation starts replacing information, the next step is usually pretty predictable here. The person gets turned and we put them in a category. We just lump them in. At that point, they're no longer being heard as an individual. They become men, women, dominants, submissives, victims, abusers, therapists, clients, whatever the label, athlete. It doesn't really matter. But they become whatever label happens to fit the story being told. Their actual words start carrying less weight than everything the listener already believes about that group. And this is where the conversation really starts to break down. Now, a man says something awkward or questions a part of an exchange, and suddenly he's not answering for himself anymore. He's answering for every man who's ever been, who's ever dismissed, pressured, or even harmed a woman. A woman raises a concern and people decide she must be manipulative, unstable, or trying to create drama because they've seen other women behave in a similar fashion before. A dominant gets judged through every bad experience somebody has had with power. Or, a submissive is treated like they can't possibly have agency because they've already decided what submission means. The category starts carrying the argument. Once that happens, the person can say almost anything and it's going to be filtered through the label. If they explain themselves, that becomes, again, defensiveness. If they're quiet and they say nothing, that's guilt. Even their reaction can be treated as proof that the label was right. The category has already decided what their behavior means before they do anything. And this is why these conversations feel impossible. The listener is no longer responding to what was actually said. They're responding to a backlog of experiences and beliefs and fears and assumptions attached to a group they think you belong to. And sometimes that comes from real harm. People do carry history. If someone has repeatedly been dismissed by men or controlled by a dominant, manipulated, or betrayed by someone in authority, that history is going to affect how they read the next interaction. And that makes sense. But understanding why someone does it is not the same as pretending it is fair. You can't take one person, load them up with every bad experience you've had with everything, with everyone like them, and then call that an honest conversation. At some point, they stop being a person and they become the stand-in. That also happens with labels like victim and abuser. Once someone is placed into either category, people stop allowing complexity. A victim is expected to behave a certain way. They're supposed to be consistent and sympathetic and easy to believe. If they're angry or messy or contradictory or wrong about a part of the story, people start questioning everything. And on the other side, once someone is called an abuser, every word they say can be treated as manipulation before the facts are even clear. And sometimes the label is accurate. Other times it isn't. Now, either way, once the category takes over, people stop looking at behavior and start defending the label. And categories feel useful because they reduce uncertainty for us. They give people a quick moral position and make a complicated situation easier to sort. But the cost is that the person disappears. And when the person disappears, so does any real chance of understanding what actually happened. Now, I want to talk about something here because two things recently, and I mentioned them last week, but they really apply to this week. I was brought into one conversation um, with somebody I was talking to, getting to know, colleagues, mutual footing, and uh, I wrote a post in support of it gave me an idea, and I wrote a post about no and how it's just a complete sentence. It's the end of a discussion. Once that word is uttered, there is no discussion afterwards, right? And we're talking in any physical or dynamic sense, right? It's a complete sentence. So then I had inquired, I said, oh, what made you, talk about this? So I listened, and of course, the thing, I got asked if I understand the man versus bear discussion, and I do. But here's the issue I start taking is that, it gets said, we just need good men to stand up. I said, my reply was, what would a good man do to those who are uneducated in the online sphere? How will that change behavior? And that's a fair question to ask. Once I asked that, I became part of the problem. So I'm no longer judged on the fact that I'm not these people, that I don't conduct myself in this behavior, I don't act in those ways. But, context did matter, because then I also asked about person's behavior. All these things, and I've seen this play out on social media everywhere, all these things matter. So after that, the conversation, it's crickets now, which is fine. I understand that. But being lumped in doesn't feel good either. But I got decided because I didn't take a stand. And, I've done shows in the past about virtue signaling and why I don't agree with it. I also am very well aware that on the internet, people can feign anonymity. You don't know if you're really who you're really talking to. You don't really see them, right? I mean, I have my shows, I have my picture, people know me, I've worked with enough people, they all know who I am. But a lot of these accounts that are made daily, you don't know. You don't know if they're sock accounts or bot accounts, whatever the question may be, and that becomes problematic. But if you start lumping everybody together, then what you're doing is isolationist. The other problem becomes, like I said, putting everybody in. But what's the context that brought these things across? Now, in my field, and if you look at the world of psychology, this world of psychology, what we're looking at is human behavior. What drives something else? Can one thing be responsible and that still matter, even if deplorable behavior comes after that has nothing to do with it? Absolutely, both things can exist, but one drove the other. I've talked about this in the past, but that wasn't allowed to be brought up. That became an excuse. No, it's very relevant. I don't agree with, and I'm going to be very clear about this, so there's no distinction in my voice. I don't agree with anyone, I don't care who it is, fantasy pushing, being derogatory, nothing on somebody's social media. I don't. I think you're doing something wrong. Can I change that behavior? No, I can't, because I'm not them. I don't control what somebody else does. But we also have to realize, if we put our lives online, there are going to be bad faith actors, and we have to use the tools at our dispensal that are available to us. Sorry about that. To handle these situations. But we also have to realize what brought that to us. What hand and what's the context that allowed that in? And asking that doesn't take away from the bad behavior you received, but we do need to understand what drove it. If asking that makes me a terrible person, well, then I don't think anybody is going to like the world of psychology, because that's what we ask. What's driving the behavior? Now, I'm not going to get into the whole OnlyFans thing. I've done that show to death. I have a feeling about all that stuff, and that's fine. I don't care if people want to do it, but OnlyFans models are selling themselves, and they're selling content. So I'm going to be very clear about this. The majority that I have seen in places like X or on Fetlife are not there because they're into BDSM. They're selling themselves so they can make money. That's fine. But they use the lexicon of words, and it drives behavior. They were kicked off Tinder, right? All of these things matter. Context matters. And if we can't talk about the context, we're going to have a real problem in society, because then everything is going to come down to how somebody feels, and we're going to dismiss what the facts are. And I'm sorry, the world doesn't work that way. I don't operate that way. And I'm pretty sure the majority of people don't operate that way. And if this is going to upset some of you, or say, oh, well, gosh, I can't believe you said that, well, then you're very free to unfollow me, because I have some other things at the end of the show I'm going to talk about that happened to me this past week that I'm not happy about. And I really want to stray away from that stuff, because I like talking about the puppies and doing stuff for the homeless and working at the beach. But you know what? I'm still a person. And anyways, I'm deflecting. All right. Can hear the exasperation in my voice on this one today. The show's going to has irked me a little bit trying to do this one. All right. Before I get back into all of this, This show is supported by Enhanced Mind Counseling. And one thing I've learned after years of working with people is that the first explanation isn't always the right one. Whether it's a relationship, a conflict, or something from your own past, understanding usually begins when you're willing to slow down and ask better questions and look at the whole picture instead of the easiest answer. That's the approach I take in my practice, helping people make sense out of complicated situations, understand the patterns underneath them, what's sitting in the shadows there, and move forward with greater clarity. If that's something you'd like to explore, you can reach out through my website. There's a link in the show's description. All right, let's get back to this now. Let's talk about certainty and even missing information. I think that's a bigger part here. The bigger problem is what people do when the information is missing. Most people do not like uncertainty. They want to know what happened. They want to know who was right, who was wrong, what someone meant, and ultimately, what should we do about it? Online, that pressure gets even harder and stronger because everything is moving at a blinding speed. And people start reacting before they've had time to even think. And once a position is taken publicly, backing away from it is not just embarrassing, it's almost impossible. And now the gaps start getting filled. Sometimes they're filled with assumptions or personal experience or with whatever the community has already decided that people like this usually mean. And the missing information doesn't stay empty for long. That's where certainty begins to form. Now, if someone sees a partial exchange here and decides that they understand the motive behind it without even knowing what's going on, and if they read one sentence, they believe they know everybody's tone, what they were saying, right? They look at a reaction and assume they know what even happened before it. So now the conclusion starts feeling solid, even though much of it was built around information they supplied themselves. Confirmation bias. And the more emotionally charged the subject is, the faster this tends to happen. Sex, consent, power, abuse, gender, relationships all start carrying strong opinions and strong histories. And people rarely approach those subjects as blank slates. They bring their beliefs about how men should behave, how women should behave, what dominance and subs are supposed to be like, and what guilt or innocence should look like. That history affects what they notice and what they ignore, right? Now, information that supports the first conclusion gets treated as important. If that information gets, that it begins to complicate this thing, that stuff becomes or is deemed irrelevant or defensive, manipulating, or even distracting. Context is no longer being examined, it's being filtered according to whether it helps or hurts the positions that are already taken. This is where it gets interesting. Now, at that point, certainty becomes self protecting. Anything that confirms the belief is accepted. Anything that challenges becomes further evidence. Now, if someone here along the way corrects the story, guess what they're doing? They're trying to control the narrative. If someone asks for more information, they're minimizing the harm. If, God forbid, we point out some sort of inconsistency, they're attacking the person who spoke up. There is no answer they can give because a conclusion has already been built in a way that cannot be questioned. It's a self-protecting loop. This is why emotional certainty cannot be treated as proof. Feeling sure is not the same as knowing, and feeling offended does not automatically mean an offense has occurred in the way you understood it. And suspicion does not establish motive. And even feeling empathy for someone doesn't mean you have to have the complete account. You're just sucked in. All these reactions matter. They tell us that something deserves attention, but they can't replace the work of finding out what actually happened. And that work is often less satisfying than a quick conclusion. Because we are more amped in a society right now, in my belief, the way the world is going, to break out the pitchforks and break out the torches and completely crucify somebody without even knowing. And we don't even care. And there are plenty of conclusions. There are plenty of examples. I can think of. I can think of one out of Chicago, which was the biggest one by an actor. And it was terrible. And it was proven to be a hoax. But it did enough that we stopped asking questions. No one asked questions. Even I didn't even ask any questions. It's a great example I can think of. Right? There are others. I've seen it in the community. Right? I remember an accusation of an assault. The only problem with their story was the person happened to be in another state that they were accusing. Didn't line up. Right? But nobody cared. Nobody cared about that. It was pretty hard to travel some, like, I don't know, I think the distance was something like 400 or 500 miles. Can't do that in an hour. I don't even think, well, maybe in a plane, but I'm pretty sure that other person didn't own a plane. It's not the point. I'm not looking for innocence, and I'm not saying harm doesn't happen. Those things are not the same. I'm just saying that context matters. We need to understand what's going on. We need to understand when somebody gets hurt, what do we do? What are all the facts that are surrounding it? Because otherwise we get sucked in, right? Sometimes it means asking, before the screenshot, or checking whether people involved have, had an existing relationship. It means separating what was directly said from what was inferred. And it could even mean admitting that one person behaved badly without accepting every claim that was made about them. That is harder than choosing a side. It relies on people to hold off the moral performance long enough to gather the information. It also requires the possibility that the first interpretation may have been completely wrong. I know, I slowed that down. There's a reason. Because when we jump without knowing, leap without looking, the damage we can do is sometimes unrepairable. Now, a lot of people say they want accountability, but accountability without context quickly becomes punishment. You can't honestly judge someone's choices while refusing to look at the circumstances in which those choices were made. It doesn't mean every circumstance changes the outcome. The fuller picture confirms the behavior was exactly as bad as it first appeared. But you don't know that until you look. Context is not a loophole here. It's the information required to understand what you're judging. Without it, certainty becomes a substitute for knowledge. And people stop asking what happened and they start defending what they've already believe happened. And once that takes over, the facts no longer lead the conversation. They are being allowed in only when they support the verdict. And that leads me to this, holding two truths at once. And this is where we're going to wind this all, tie it all together for you. This is where context becomes uncomfortable because sometimes acknowledging it sounds like blame, even when that's not what's happening. Someone can post a very explicit sexual image or video or even a story or whatever else and still have the right to boundaries. No one's questioning that, and I fully support it. They still have the right to decide who speaks to them and how they're approached and what kind of interaction they're willing to have. Posting sexual material is not blanket consent. I'm pretty sure we can all agree with that. It does not give permission, to anyone for harassment or pressure them into something, or ignoring a refusal or act as, what this content, somehow granted access to an image means that they have access to the person. That responsibility belongs to whoever crossed the line. But at the same time, the material being posted is still part of the context. So in the same space it appears, the way the profile is presented, the histories of the interactions there, or whatever expectations have been created around it, those things affect people. And they also affect how those people understand the environment and what kind of attention it attracts. Saying that doesn't transfer responsibility away from the person who's behaved badly. It just acknowledges that people respond to what they see. And let me be clear about something here. About 2 or 3 years, oh no, God, probably longer than that, 3 or 4 years ago, there was this content creator. in Europe. I'm just going to limit it to Europe. I like this person's work. I followed it, especially because they did a lot of mental health stuff. Don't really care about their pictures. As a friend of mine told me the other day, you see enough of that stuff, you don't really care about it anymore. And I don't really wasn't there for this person's photos. I liked what they wrote. So one day, obviously, I saw this article from this person and I read it, and they were very upset and yelling specifically at guys. And okay, and I'm like, I was ready to fire up my torch and grab a pitchfork. And I got curious. For a minute because this person's imagery and stuff got made the popular parts of Fetlife. Now, I did something that one thing I hated about studying psychology was statistics. I did an analysis. That's actually part of some work I used to do and I still do in my past. Now, what was interesting, I ended up going through all of this person's photos, calculated it at the time. It was like 130 some odd, 37 or 39 photos. That wasn't the problem. And I can care less what they did, and that's their forms of self-expression. What was the context, though? Asking people to engage, so putting question marks as the captions, asking them what they want to be done to them. All of these things do matter. And the first thing, I already know some of you are going to say, Chris, you're victim blaming. I'm not. The context matters. Because if you're inviting that behavior, you're shaping it. And we have to put the moral judgment down and look at the situation. I don't care that person they want to do that content, completely fine. Go ahead. When I ended up responding to this person's article about the moral shame and men do better, from the same person who was the day before in a picture of them in a very intimate pose asking to be used by, what would you do to me, or which hole would you use first? You're asking for engagement. Now, that context matters. And so when I went through all these images, I posted the statistics. It was something like 39% of the time requesting, engagement from the audience. 42% of the time was included self-degradation. All of these things do matter. And I'm not saying you can't post this. No, post away. That's wonderful. It's a form of self-expression. But the problem is that you also then want to control the behavior that you are also engaging in. Context matters. That distinction matters. If we're not going to acknowledge that, then we have a problem. And this goes back to the issue that I addressed before about OnlyFans. When they came over and adopted that lexicon of words, people that also followed them over started believing that others follow the same premise, especially when they get bombarded by something like about 1 million images a year saying roughly, 200,000 to 300,000 of them say the same thing. It affects behavior. That's what I understand. For me, in any interaction anyone's ever had with me privately, it's always, greetings, how are you? What brought you to the lifestyle? What interests you about this or that? That's how I talk. I don't really discuss it any other way because I'm not interested in all. I don't even know how you get from seeing a photo to fantasy pushing, because that's not even BDSM. That's a whole different discussion. But we need to understand that context matters. The person is they're holding that context. I'm not condoning the behavior. The behavior that gets pushed then is wrong. But then we also have to look at, are we bringing that in? If you can't handle that question, or you find it offensive, or you think it's automatically victim blaming, well, first off, there isn't a victim because you're encouraging it. The context matters. Now, then the question is going to be, what about those who don't? You're right. There are the outliers that don't do that. And those people that are approaching them or sending them messages, they're still wrong. Unfortunately, there's no way to police it. Internet behavior doesn't act that way. I don't have a solution for you on that. And it's not just limited to one gender, but it seems to be excused If it's females doing it, I have noticed that more compared to men. And that mommy, baby boy, I don't know if that's daddy dom. So what would that mommy dom, little boy? I don't know if that MDLB, I don't know if that's a thing, right? Or mommy doms or dominatrixes or, fin doms, even older women dating younger men. Those things all get excused. Their behavior and the words they say get excused. But if it gets flipped, right? Context matters. I know this is going to ruffle feathers because, I'm Chris, you're a man. And you're just, now it has nothing to do with that. If the first thing you are going to see and all you're going to view me is put me into that label, then you're missing the entire point of this episode. And you're doing exactly what I'm predicting is happening. I don't care what people do. I want you to live your best life. I want you to have fun and be safe. And most of all, be kinky, if that's your thing. But we need to understand that we do have responsibility for our actions. Your actions, if you do something, if you decide to drink and drive, that's not the other person's fault that you crashed into them. It's your responsibility. You gotta take ownership for that, right? Now, saying all of this doesn't transfer, again, I'm going to repeat that, it doesn't transfer responsibility from the person who's acting like an ass or behaving badly. We understand this in every part of our life. But the way all these things is presented, it affects how it's read and how the setting matters, everything. None of that decides whether a person has the right to cross a boundary. It does help explain how the interaction developed and where the communication has failed. The trouble begins when people think they must choose between two extreme positions. Either the person posting sexual material has no responsibility for how the space is presented, or they're somehow responsible for every inappropriate response they receive. Now, neither position is honest. A person can have complete authority over their boundaries while also recognizing their choices shape the environment around them. Someone else can misread the setting and still remain responsible for what they do after that. A misunderstanding may explain the beginning of an interaction, but it doesn't excuse ignoring a clear boundary once that's been given. And that distinction matters. It's not me calling it out because I'm some sort of demon. And trust me, I've heard a lot this past week because God forbid that I say the things that I just don't jump in. I want context. And maybe that becomes from my past. I've worked in law enforcement. I was in the military. I worked as juvenile probation. Context matters. It all matters. I have plenty of stories. I don't even want to give you ones because I have one that has stuck with me. Where am I at? Some 20 plus years later since I worked in Atlanta. And it just affects me so because of what happened. Because initially I saw the interaction and I'm like, guilty, don't care. And then I decided to read and I started to start asking questions. The context mattered. And then my heart broke for that young person. What was far worse was what happened at sentencing because context mattered. Right? Our views are shaped by what we hear and what we ask. But if we're refusing to ask and we only see what's set in front of our eyes, you might be led down a bad path. Look, context explains the conditions around behavior. Responsibility tells us who owns the behavior itself. Those are related questions, but they're not the same question. When we refuse to separate them, the discussion usually collapses. Asking about presentation gets treated as victim blaming, and defending someone's boundaries gets interpreted as pretending their choices had no effect on the exchange at all. So people move towards whatever side feels morally safest, and they stop examining what actually occurred. And let me tell you, I'm hearing about this all of a sudden since I've announced it. Well, I've been talking about this stuff now for a couple of weeks, but I've been getting a lot of emails. This is happening in my community or at my dungeon or so on and so forth. And yeah, you know, so I'm obviously not making it up. Now, by holding two truths at once, it's not a moral confusion. It's often the only way to have an honest discussion. Someone can deserve respect and still have contributed to how a situation was understood, and another person can have misunderstood the context and still be fully responsible for crossing a line. We don't have to erase one truth to protect the other. Context doesn't excuse harm. It tells us what surrounded it, what shaped it, and what may prevent the same thing from happening again. And pretending none of that matters does not protect accountability. It replaces understanding with a very simple answer. As I wind this down here, the cost of losing context is not only that we may get something wrong, it's that we have stopped seeing the person in front of us. Once we decide what someone represents, listening becomes almost impossible. Their words are filtered through the role we've assigned them, and anything that does not fit gets dismissed. Facts become inconvenient, questions are suspicious, and any clarity sounds like resistance. What could have been a conversation turns out to be judgment. Now, that may feel decisive, but it's not the same thing as being fair. And real accountability requires enough information to understand what took place, right? What each person actually did and where the responsibility belongs. Sometimes the fuller picture will confirm the first impression, and that's fine. And other times it's going to expose assumptions that never should have happened you know, in the first place, let alone that it should have been treated as fact. Either way, asking for context is not refusing to take a position. It's making sure that the position is based on something real. We're not required to excuse harmful behavior. I don't. I explain behavior, I don't excuse it. We're not required to overlook the warning signs or ignore the effects of someone's actions that, they've had. We're simply responsible for not replacing missing information with whatever conclusion feels most familiar or satisfying to us. So I'm going to leave you with this question this week. What would change if we asked for the missing context before deciding we already knew the whole story? Now, I know there's issues in a lot of communities, and look, I see a lot of stuff. The virtue signaling online, it's, my God, in the last 2 days alone, I've seen about 5 or 6 guys get on there. I'm not dating younger women. Hey, don't comment on my stuff. I don't even understand. I'm aligning with this group. Why? Virtue signaling doesn't help. And I don't care who does it. Mostly, past few days, just happens to be, I don't know, about 5 guys. I don't really understand the whole point. Let alone, we're done. Apparently, the kink community, the community I grew up in, the community I've been a part for going on near 28 years, we're done with your kink is not my kink. Now, apparently that's gone. Well, no, it's not gone. Because there's stuff I like to do that would make, that's a Tuesday for me that some people couldn't do on their best Friday. Not because it's an insult, it's because we're in two different worlds. I'm a sadist. Some people aren't into pain. But that doesn't mean I'm ever going to stop, and no one has the right to tell me that. And we need to understand these things. And the kink community is getting to the point it's not. I've talked about the substance abuse and the alcohol at dungeons. I am talking, the sex parties at dungeons. That wasn't what dungeons were created for. Now, I don't know why the shift, and I frankly don't care. I will say I don't frequent those places. There was a really nice place I've been to in Belgium a few times. I'm not going to say where, but it's changed. I'm not going back. They've noticed. I've said why. I don't like those environments. That's not what BDSM is for me. And I'm going to be very honest about this because some people seem to misunderstand this, but the context matters. BDSM and sex, they're not synonymous. You can negotiate them in, but if that's all you're doing, you're just having kinky sex. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's a separate category from what I do. That's a separate category from what I know most people really in the lifestyle do. It's why you'll always hear me frame it as a lifestyle, not just kink. Right? I know this sounds like I am irritated by this because I'm so irritated that when I've got to ask for context or people want to bring me into a story, and if I ask for background, they get mad because I'm asking for it. I don't side with anything. There is a whole nother conversation I am trying to still figure out how to bring a show to you all on about discrimination towards groups because it's not easy. I'm not going to just pick a group. It needs to be a lot of groups because otherwise that's making the show political, and I won't do that. And they know this, and they're waiting very patiently. Some have appreciated me asking for context, and a couple got offended. Well, I'm sorry. That's an issue for them, not for me. Right? I want to talk about this. I think it's important. I've seen a lot of you already have responded really well. I've gotten, I don't know, I have about 30 emails I need to reply to on this. But let me know what you think about this. Let's talk about it. Let's keep it civil, right? Two other things I want to address. First off, the other day I had announced my AMA was coming to an end, and I really forgot to add in that get your final questions in. The reason why is because whoever had graciously gifted me that, it was coming to an end, but I'm not going to pay for it. I'm not. And the reason why is I produce my own show, I write my articles, I give away a lot of free stuff. It costs me time and money to do that. And one commenter decided to say, well, I should just do it because it serves the community. No, that's not how this works. I've still got to put food and pay my rent. I got to put food on the table and pay my rent and pay my bills. So the last thing I'm going to worry about is whether or not I give people access to AMAs. Right now, two people have stepped up. I'm not going to say their names. They've been thanked privately. I'm going to keep doing this for another 18 or AMAs for another 18 months. Right. But I'm not a free resource. And if you treat me poorly, you're just going to start getting blocked. I don't have the mental capacity or bandwidth to argue with people online. Also, if you attack other people before I've had a chance to respond, I'm banning you. I don't do that anymore. Right? It's not the environment I want on my social media. I'm open. I'm all for discussions. Sometimes they can get hot. Maybe you need to step away. But if you attack other people or attack me, the conversation is over. I've made this clear 100 times before, but apparently, I don't know. People don't seem to understand. Anyway, so there we are. There's the context. There's the show for you. Let's discuss it. Here's your question one more time. What would you change if we asked for the missing context before deciding we already knew the whole story? What do you think would change? Let me know in the comments, right? Let's talk about it. Until next time, everybody, be safe and stay kinky.